Okay, cool. Cool. Yeah. So thanks for inviting me along. Always interested to talk conversation design, best practice and whatnot. And really, there's a few points I suppose to get across in here. One is why conversation design and why now. The other is what is it basically? What does it mean to design for conversations? What's the anatomy of what that looks like? How do you do it? What kind of frameworks can you use? And I think there'll be some similar things in here that, if you've got a UX background and a design background, there'll be some things in here that are kind of familiar to you, which is good. And then, where can you go after this? If you wanted to learn more, if you wanted to start doing it, what can you do? Where can you go? So that's the general format. I'm Kane Sims, as Shakib said. I actually think it might have been 2018, Shakib. I think it was even longer ago than that when we first met. But yeah, we've been doing this for a number of years now. We've got a consultancy which helps brands and organizations create conversational AI strategies and implement conversational AI solutions. We've got the media side of the company, which is a podcast we do every week, live on LinkedIn and YouTube. So if you are interested in, the ins and outs and details of how to design and implement conversational strategies and solutions and how to design them, then check that out. And we publish quite a lot as well on our website, industry analysis and best practice and stuff like that. And so that's pretty much what we do. On the conversation side of things, first of all, what is a conversation design? What is a conversational user interface? Essentially, I'm sure by now most people are kind of familiar with conversational user interfaces. I mean, when we first started in kind of like late 2017, the term conversational user interface was known, but it wasn't necessarily that widely used. It was more like people used to call it chatbots quite a lot. Voice was starting to really gain traction. Alexa was just launched in the UK, it'd been doing pretty well in the US. And so it was fragmented, the industry was fragmented. You had chatbots on one side and people building and developing chatbots. A lot of them were kind of rule-based, which we might come on to in a minute, but it means that they weren't really effective, basically. And then you had voice on the other side, and the voice industry was kind of booming and emerging, and Google Assistant and Siri and Alexa were really kind of taking off. And probably in the last sort of 12 months or so, those two areas have kind of fused together and have kind of collided, and everyone who was creating voice assistants and voice applications, they're also doing chat as well. Everyone who was doing chat is now trying to do voice as well. And there's some interesting similarities on that front from a technology perspective and from a design perspective, but there's also some real stark differences. And so conversational AI is essentially, or conversational user interfaces, is essentially both of those things. Voice user interfaces, which you'll be familiar with if you have Alexa or Google Assistant or you talk to Siri, and chat interfaces like chatbots that you might find on websites and in apps and things like that, as well as messaging channels like WhatsApp, Telegram, those kind of applications all have the ability to have a conversational interface within them. And really, when I talk about conversational interfaces, I'm talking about something that allows you to communicate with it using natural language, using your own language, however you decide to describe something. The system recognizes what it is that you've said and what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and then is able to respond off the back of that, either to do something like turning off a light or switching on your heating or locking your front door, whatever it might be, or it might respond back to you with verbal response in the case of Alexa, reading out the weather, for example, or it might be in the chat interface. You've got images, you've got kind of like clickable carousels, links, videos, all that kind of stuff. But the fundamentals are it's typically natural language in and typically an action or natural language back, essentially. And then you've got live chat, which could be classed as a conversational interface, but it doesn't have the AI in the background, unless they're using what's called agent assist, but we won't kind of go down that route yet. Let's just focus on the user-facing side of conversational AI. And why is now a good time, if you're a designer, why is now a good time to be thinking about creating or learning how to create conversational user interfaces? Well, these are just a few things that we've thrown out there. There's lots more stats than this. In fact, every week there's a new research kind of report or a new thing that's released with more data about why voice or why conversational AI is growing the way it's growing. 30% of the UK right now have a smart speaker. I would be surprised if at least one person in this meetup right now doesn't, or does rather. And that's the growth of smart speakers has been in 2018. It was growing. The adoption of smart speakers was growing faster than smartphones ever did, and it's been absolutely exponential. It's over 30% of the UK now have a smart speaker, and it's only been available for something like 4 years or so in this country. Over 50% of all mobile phone owners use the voice assistant on their phone. We did some research the other week that found that Google Assistant, Google announced that 20% of all searches on mobile are voice searches. And I think we forecasted that it was in somewhere in the region of like, what was it, 780 million searches per minute, I think it was, or per day, something like that. Some crazy wild number of searches are being done and initiated through Google Assistant on a mobile device every day. And it's not just that the people are using it and it's obviously less friction. You can do things a lot easier, but there's also real potential there for businesses. The value of the v-commerce market, as it's kind of known, the voice commerce market, is around about $80 billion forecast by 2023. And I use Alexa for ordering. Like my go-to purchase on Alexa is dog poo bags, believe it or not, and dog treats. Those are the two things that I could recommend work seamlessly when purchasing on Alexa. But as you start getting comfortable using your voice to transact, you start building trust in that interface. It opens up a world of possibilities. 58% of people say that voice-activated personal assistants have already transformed their expectation of companies. And if you think about as you build trust in them as well, you expect more of them, and you expect more of the companies that have them. So if you think about how I liken it to the fact that Google, maybe I don't know, let's say 15 years ago, 10 years ago, Google was in the process of redefining or actually defining what it meant to perform a search on a website. And how Google worked, the fact that you could just type something and get a fairly accurate response to that search, shapes your expectations in your mental model of what a search is and how search works. And so when you go to a website, it doesn't matter if it's a small government organization or a large insurance company, when you search on that website, your mental model of what happens and the fact that you get a result is built upon the confidence that you've been building for years, and the expectations that Google have been setting. And same thing with Amazon. If you look at Amazon over the years with one-click payments and stuff like that, same-day deliveries, Amazon have redefined what it means to shop, full stop, right? And so when it doesn't matter now whether you go to ASOS or whether you go to, Topshop or wherever you go to shop for anything, the expectation that you have around easy, seamless checkout, same day or at least next day delivery at no additional cost. All of these expectations that you have are now shaped because of the work that Amazon has been doing in building that confidence and setting those expectations. What those companies doing now, and many others, including IBM and Microsoft and Facebook recently to some extent, what they're doing is they're redefining what it means to communicate and have a relationship with a company. When you get used to playing any music, any song that you want, but just by asking for it, you pull up your schedule, you can send text messages, you can make phone calls, you can perform web searches, you can get information, you can control your house, you can start your car. When you get used to being able to do all of that stuff just with your voice and not touching anything, those expectations over time are going to be placed on every company that anybody interacts with. And I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, the first touch point for most companies is going to be an AI. And someone, somewhere, needs to design all of those interactions, which is why the kind of industry, the design community now is so enthused about conversation design, because the possibilities are absolutely, endless, and the need is huge. We're so short skilled at the moment in conversational AI. It's unbelievable. But it's not new. People think it's new. People think it's nascent. People think that Alexa's only been around for a couple of years. It's a brand new thing. The reality is that it's decades and decades old. The first artificial speech synthesizer was the Voda in 1939. The first speech recognition system was Audrey in 1952. In fact, we had ReadSpeaker on the podcast. ReadSpeaker create synthesized voices, text-to-speech voices, as it's called, TTS. And they were telling us a story of a system that existed in the late 1800s that was a speech recognition system. And so it's been around for a long time. What's changed recently, around about 2010 with Siri and 2012 with Google Now, as it was then called, is natural language understanding. Most of these things, Wildfire, Dragon Dictate, Nuance, most of this was just speech recognition, taking audio of speech and translating it into text. What the real leap forward was NLU, natural language understanding, the ability to be able to understand what somebody means when they say something and translate that kind of unstructured sentence into structured data that a machine can understand. And that's what Siri kind of pioneered among other companies. And then, Alexa came out in 2014 and popularized it, created a whole new category of products, and the rest, as they say, is kind of history. And so, although we think it's new, it's not actually that new, but what is new is the kind of enthusiasm around it. In 1997 and 1994, there was a whole bunch of enthusiasm around automated IVR conversations, putting speech technology in contact centers. There was a big community around it, and it kind of died down because the technology wasn't really good enough. All of that has been resurfaced now and rekindled. And even Amazon Alexa reached the kind of peak of hype, and when Shakib did that study with Hemel, it was kind of almost at the peak of its hype as far as technology hype is concerned. TechCrunch are covering it. All these kind of publications are covering it. It's being hyped up. Expectations are inflated. And in the last couple of years, it's dampened down a bit. There's this concept on the Gartner hype cycle of the trough of disillusionment, which is when something reaches the pinnacle of its hype, people realize that it can't quite do everything they expected it to do, and then the expectations just kind of die down, the hype dies down, and then what happens is slowly it picks back up again, but it reaches a realistic and useful position in the market, and that's kind of where Amazon is on the way to now with Alexa, and same with Google Assistant. So with that, we know that there's a shortage of skills. We know that, and by the way, the Slido thing is on there. If you do have questions, go to slido.com, put that ID in, and feel free to fire the questions across. We'll do our best to answer them. And I know I'm probably already running over time now, so we might need to get to those sooner rather than later. But I wanted to definitely touch on the anatomy of a conversation, because if you're thinking about designing a conversation, you really need to understand what's going on. When someone says something or types something, what's happening? Where does that go? What AI, as it's called, what's actually working behind the scenes? How does it work behind the scenes? And if you're a conversation designer, what actually will you do as a conversation designer? And so this really is the anatomy of what a conversational AI looks like and what it does. So on the left-hand side, you've got your devices, right? And, a conversational AI can exist in a whole manner of different devices. It can exist in apps with voice or chat. It can exist on websites with voice or chat. It can exist in call centers, so that when you make a phone call, there's a bot there that answers the call. It can exist on devices like voice assistants. And you'll notice now that every single thing at CES these days has a voice interface, and that's because it's so easy to put a mic and a chip into almost any device and connect it to the internet that almost all devices have the potential to be voice enabled, and certainly all screen-based devices have the potential to be chat enabled. And so device independent, doesn't really matter what the device is, but what happens is, in let's use voice as an example because there's an added piece to the puzzle with voice. What happens is that, let's say that you talk to your voice assistant and you say, Alexa, tell me the weather. What happens is the ASR, which is called speech to text, first of all, there's wake word detection, which happens on the device, which is the little, the device isn't always listening in terms of being connected to the cloud, but it's always listening out for a pattern, and that pattern is the wake word. When you trigger the wake word, what happens is it enables this ASR layer, which is speech to text or automatic speech recognition. And what that does is when you talk, it takes the audio stream and it streams it up to the cloud, all right? It's basically like a VoIP phone call. If you phone someone over WhatsApp, the call's going to the cloud, it's going to your friend's WhatsApp phone. That's basically what's happening. It's streaming the audio up to the cloud. Then what happens is it processes the audio and it turns the audio signal into text, okay? So what's left is a piece of a string of text. That text then gets fed into what's called a natural language understanding module, or an NLU as it's known. And the NLU's job is to figure out what it is that this text actually means. All right. And what that does is it turns this phrase and maps it to what's called an intent. And an intent is essentially like something that a user is trying to accomplish. All right. What does this sentence mean? What are they trying to actually do? So if you said, Alexa, book me a taxi, the intent of the words book me a taxi would be a booking intent, for argument's sake. And then it also, from that sentence, it will also try and extract entities. And entities are little pieces of information that exist within a sentence that matter to the conversation, or that matter to that intent. So in that taxi booking example, if you need to book a taxi, there are certain things that the application, your application, will need to get from the user in order to be able to successfully book that taxi. So you'll need to know, where do they want picking up from? You'll need to know, where do they want dropping off at? You'll need to know, what day do they want to be traveling, and what time do they want to travel. Maybe there's other things as well. But those things are what's called entities. That's the data that matters to you, because with that data, you can successfully process a booking. And so NLU is the core component of conversational AI. It's one of the main things that you'll be working with when you design conversations. And that's job is to take this phrase, figure out the intent, and extract the entities to be able to pass over to the dialogue management system. And an entity, for example, as well, if you could also say something like, Alexa, book me a taxi for 3 people on Tuesday at 4, and that whole phrase would trigger the intent, which is the booking intent, but 3 people, Tuesday, 4 p.m. are entities, and it will extract those entities and pass all of that through to this dialogue management system. And the dialogue management system, when people talk about conversation design flows, and they talk about kind of like designing conversations, this is more or less where this happens. And what that does is it says, when someone says this, or this kind of thing that matches to this intent, what do we do with that? What do we do next? When someone says, Alexa, book me a taxi, and your dialogue management system finds that booking intent and it gets past that, what do you do with that? What happens next? And inside the dialogue management, you'll then set the rules, you set the flows, and the next step might be, when this happens, what we want to do is we want to ask them, okay, cool, where do you want the taxi to pick you up from? And then what you do in the dialogue management system is you say, when we ask the user, where do you want picking up from, we expect certain results back. We expect them to say one of these number of different things. And when they do say that, this is what happens next. And so this dialogue management system basically governs the conversation, and within there as well, you can then make calls out to APIs to integrate into different line of business systems and knowledge bases and things like that, so that when someone says, okay, book that taxi, you can then send all of that information that's being gathered as part of that conversation into your booking system to actually initiate and make the booking and make it happen. Then what happens is, when the dialogue management system determines what to respond to the user, so when someone says, I'd like a taxi, please, and your dialogue management says, okay, when someone says, I'd like a taxi, please, we want to say to them, cool, when do you want it? That response, when do you want it, is then sent via text. And if it's a chatbot, that text is just sent straight back to the interface, which might be a chatbot on a website. Or in a voice system, that text is sent to a different system, which is called text-to-speech, TTS. And what that does is it synthesizes the speech and reads it back out to the user. Okay, so it takes text, turns it into audio, and it speaks it back out. And there's all kinds of tweaks you can make in those text-to-speech systems to make them sound a bit more natural and all that kind of stuff. So that's the fundamentals of a conversational AI. And as a conversation designer, your role will exist all across all of this pipeline, basically. And so the component parts of a conversation designer's job include: 1, figuring out what people will ask, figuring out what a good use case looks like in the first place. Like, what do people need from this bot? What do people need from this phone call? What do people need from this app, or whatever it might be? And so that requires a lot of user research. It requires a lot of data analysis, analyzing calls, analyzing website traffic, analyzing search data, anything you can get your hands on that is kind of real customer insight, preferably written in their own words, social media comments, things like that. Fantastic places to get data from. So your job, first of all, is to figure out what should this thing do and what will people ask it. Then once you've figured that out, is you turn all of those things into a series of intents, which we've kind of spoke about. The intents are what things are people trying to get done, and you would specify those intents. One might be booking a taxi, the other one might be querying a price, the other thing might be applying for a refund, making a complaint. There might be loads of different intents, and then you want to train the NLU. And when we say train the NLU, that includes specifying the entities that you're expecting, which might be things like location, destination, those kind of things. So you specify those for each intent. And you also provide other training data, which is called sample utterances. And those sample utterances essentially are examples of the kind of things that people will say to this bot. All right, which is why it's so important to get actual data from customers and understand how they speak. And what you do with this sample data is you train your intents, you train your NLU, and you say, here's 20, 30, 40 different phrases, different ways of saying, book me a taxi. One might be, book me a taxi. The other one might be, I need a ride. The other one might be, can I get an Uber? Or whatever it might be. There's lots of different ways. Google found that there's 8,000 different ways to set an alarm. So there's lots and lots of different ways that people will ask for things from you. Now, we don't need to specify 8,000 different phrases. We just need to give the NLU enough training data for it to be able to understand that when someone says something similar, they're probably talking about this, and so we match it together. And that's basically how it works. You provide sample data, training data, the types of things that people say, and even when someone asks something that's not specifically specified in your training data, it's the NLU's job to ingest that training data and make a judgment about, does this thing sound similar enough to this that I can think that it's the same intent? And that's pretty much how it works. So that's your job really as a conversation designer. One of them is figuring out what the NLU intents are, figuring out what the entities are, figuring out what data you need to train the system based on how customers ask for stuff. The other job is the dialogue management. This is pretty much what most people think a conversation designer's job is, and they very rarely think about the other component parts. But this is all about the call, the chat flow, if you like. People say flow. I think flow is the wrong way to describe it, because it's not always a flow. It's not always if this then that. It's sometimes a bit more flexible than that, and ideally it will be more flexible than that. But this is the part where you do that. When someone says this, we respond with that. Then we expect them to say these things in return. When they do that, we say this. This is where we need to go and integrate with this system to pull that data in, and then this is the response we give here. So it's all of that logic that sits inside the application, which you'll be specifying. And the fourth thing is specifying those integrations. Okay, in order for us to get a response to a user, we're going to need data from this system. We need to push something into that system. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a technical person that does this. You don't need to have real technical knowledge. You'll be working alongside developers for the whole time, and the developers will assist with the NLU. They'll assist with the dialogue management without a doubt, and they'll be the ones that build it in the end anyway. But you just need to know that at this point, we're going to need this information. And we're going to need to specify how we go and get that. The fifth thing is that we then need to send a response back to the user. So you need to create and write and design the dialogue that goes back to the customer, to the user in return. And if you're building a voice application, you also need to tune the the text-to-speech system as well. So sometimes you'll probably know that sometimes when you speak to Alexa, or if you've used a third-party skill on Alexa, you'll say something, and when it talks back, it doesn't really sound right. It just doesn't quite sound nice. With speech-to-text, you can use something called SSML, which is it's short for Speech Synthesis Markup Language, and that allows you to adjust the way that the voice talks. So if Alexa, for example, says tomorrow it's going to be sunny outside, so you should take your sunglasses with you, but maybe it pronounces sunglasses like sunglasses, like it's going to be sunny tomorrow, so take your sunglasses with you. Sometimes it might do that. So SSML allows you to change the way that word sunglasses is pronounced in order to pronounce it properly, so that it does say it's going to be sunny tomorrow, take your sunglasses with you. And so those are really the component parts of a conversation designer's job: figuring out what the customer needs, putting together the conversational flow and the dialogue and the responses, translating that into intents and entities and training the NLU, specifying what data we don't have that we need and where we're going to get it from, and then tuning and tweaking the TTS to make sure that the responses back to the user are sensible and natural. There's another component in here which is sound design, so you might use ear cons or things like that kind of bring the conversation to life. If someone's made a successful payment, you might not verbally say, "Thank you, your payment's been successful." You might do a little kind of Will Smith from Prince of Bel-Air and do a little cha-ching, or some sound effects or something. And so, but that's the fundamentals essentially. And the one last thing, which is probably one of the most important things, is analyzing and improving the conversations. Very rarely do you create a chatbot or a conversational AI that works 100% first time. The live day is basically the middle of the project, and when you go live, you then suck in all of the data from real customers talking to your bot. You work out where it's failing, you work out where it's going wrong, you retrain the data based on that, and you improve the system over time. And that's pretty much what it is. I'll skip relatively quickly through the rest, and if we do have time towards the end, I can always go back over them again, but I know there's probably questions, and so I'll kind of skip over these next few slides because I know I'm taking the piss for time. Qualities that make for successful conversations. Basing it on natural language, not push button this, push button that. Don't tell the user what to say. The worst chatbots in the world, or the worst voice bots in the world, will say, "To continue, say continue." It's like, don't tell me how to speak. I've been speaking for years. Let me speak in my language. And that's part of the difficulty, is figuring out what that language is and training your data on that. Be flexible. And when I say flexible, I mean don't use these big long trees that prevent people from moving between the conversation. When we have a conversation, a natural conversation, it moves. If we're talking about the weather, it might be, "Oh, by the way, before I forget, remind me at the end of this conversation to ask you about Thursday." "Okay, yeah, I will do, yeah." "Okay, anyway, so yeah, that snow the other night. And so we shift and we move, and we need to allow the AI to handle those movements as well. Be clear. When you prompt somebody, a prompt can basically change the response that you get. The prompt that you write is one of the most important things that you'll write. For example, let's think of an example. If you said something like, if you're booking a restaurant and you say something, and your bot says something like, "When would you want the table for?" the user might respond with Thursday, or the user might respond with 7 o'clock. Now, when you ask that question, you're looking for one of those, not both. You're looking for one of them, usually. And so being clear about the question and the prompt means that you get the best possible chance of getting the response that you're looking for. So instead of saying, "When do you want the table for?" your prompt might say something like, "What time would you like your table for?" or "What day would you like it to book your table on?" And so being really clear about your prompts gives you the best chance of getting the right kind of responses from the customer that you need to move on. The persona is important as well, because regardless of whether you consciously do this or not, every bot has a persona in the mind of the user, especially one that has a voice, because we cannot help psychologically but to assign certain personality traits and certain feelings and certain relationships with the voices that we hear. It's just what we do. And so designing a persona based on your brand values, based on having not necessarily a full personality, but you need to understand the tone, the type of voice that it's going to have, and all these kind of things are really, really crucially important. The next thing is sound design. I mentioned there that, if someone's made a successful payment, play a sound of a cash register ringing, as well as maybe as the confirmation from the voice. If someone is asking for instructions about how to restart their boiler, play a little sound at the beginning of each instruction just to liven the conversation and make it a little bit more engaging. Sound is so underutilized in all user interfaces, let alone voice interfaces, but certainly with voice, a little subtle bit of sound can make a huge, huge difference. So we don't always have to rely on dialogue. Very quickly, a framework, and we can delve back into this. The two most important things when thinking about conversational AI and conversation design is, first of all, design the right thing. This comes from Ben Sauer. Design the right thing first. Crucially important. Most chatbots fail because they start at the wrong place. They're serving the wrong needs. And then the second thing is designing the thing right. Make sure that when you do it, you solve the actual need. One thing I posted this morning, one of the articles we did was around, there was an article from Zendesk and it was talking about how the potential of conversational AI, and the example it gave for the potential of conversational AI was a chatbot that when somebody asks about a return policy, it can just send you to the return policy page on your website. That would be an example example of not designing the thing right, because very rarely do people want to know your general returns policy. They want to know the return policy for this item that I've just bought and I don't like anymore. And so a well-designed bot, if you were designing the right thing, you would ask the user what item they've got, and you would ask the user whether it's something that they want to return. And then you would go and get the return policy statement for that specific item and offer to make the actual return for the user, turn it into a transaction. So those are the two most crucial things to bear in mind. You're probably all familiar with this double diamond of design if you're a UX designer. It's one of the things that are taught. One of the first things you'll learn is the first thing to do is explore the problem, explore the user, explore and build empathy and research and figure out the life and the landscape that the user operates in. User journey mapping and user research interviews, all that kind of stuff. Then define the problem that you want to solve. Focus on what problem is going to give the user the most benefit, what problem is going to bring the business the most benefit, and then don't just build something and launch it. Build a prototype, see if you're on the right lines, test it, validate it, tweak it. Make sure that the thing you're doing stands the best chance of succeeding. With voice and with conversational AI, we add another two diamonds in there, as if it wasn't complex enough. So the first one stays the same. The second one is about sketching and deciding what the solution is going to be. So before you prototype something, we just want to come up with a number of different ideas around what this conversation might look like. Where will it exist? Will it be in WhatsApp? Will it be on Alexa? What kind of solution will it be? What's the premise of the conversation? And then decide that, vote on that, decide that. Then we want to role play. Before we get into code, before we get into a prototyping tool, just have a conversation. You can't design a conversation without having a conversation. And so just get together and role play the conversation. And you'll soon figure out what the pattern should be, what's going wrong, what kind of utterances do you need to try and capture for. And then you can decide whether the use case is something you want to take forward. And then the latter side is the same. Prototype it, test it, validate it, generate your spec, go ahead and build it. And the thing I'll leave you on is to say that, all of this might sound new, it might sound different, it might sound slightly, I don't know. I don't want to say scary because it's not. I think it's exciting. But with everything, whenever there's a new interface, whenever there's a new skill to learn, it can be a little bit daunting. But the reality is that UX designers and designers have the vast majority of the skills needed to design effective conversations. You already have that user-centric, customer-centric mindset and mentality where the customer comes first. There's no more important interface where that skill is so valuable than conversations, because you're not designing on your own, you're designing with a partner, and you have no control over what that person says to you. So you have to be inside their mind, designing the things that they want and that they will say, because if they say that and you don't design for it, it's a terrible experience, it's a terrible bot. So customer centricity is more important with conversational AI than it ever has been with any other type of interface, in my opinion. And UX designers already have that innate customer centric value that they can't move away from, which stands in them in good stead for conversation design. A lot of them are really good writers. A lot of UX designers have been forced into fitting words into a very specific sized box, and not only any words that have an impact on people, the ability for people to click the next button, or the ability for people to get to where they're going from, the ability for people to look at a menu with just 2 words and understand the kind of content that's going to be behind that button or that link. All of those skills, distilling ideas and concepts down to a few tiny words and making sure that the other person understands that, really, really vital skills that the UX designers have that they can bring to conversation design. And you've already got the methodologies, that double diamond of design, the kind of user-centric methodologies. You research first, define the problem, sketch, decide, prototype, test, validate. You've already got that stuff. The only thing that's different is the specific activities that you do within that framework. And so I think that UX designers make really good conversation designers because they have a whole bunch of the skills that are really important. Few books if you want to, and we can send these slides around afterwards as well, so I won't go over these right now, but the latest one is Conversations with Things by Rebecca Evanhoe and Diana Diebel. Rebecca is one of our trainers on our conversation design training program. Fantastic designer, been doing this for many, many years. Very few people have more experience than she does, and there's a whole bunch of really, really good books here that if you want to learn more, if you want to kind of get the basics, definitely get hold of one of these. If you don't want to have your head stuck in a book, you can always listen to our podcast, listen to the VoiceBot podcast as well. VoiceBot don't go deep into the practicalities like we do. They cover industry trends and analysis, which is still quite interesting. And This Week in Voice has all the news, all of the new stuff that's been going on within the voice and conversational AI industry, if you want to just keep up to date with goings on. And that's pretty much it. If you are interested in the podcast, check the podcast out by all means. And if you're interested in, with our conversation design training is predominantly for enterprise teams. There's other training courses out there for individuals if they kind of want to just kind of learn in your own time and stuff like that. But if you are working at a company, you're interested in learning this stuff for real, I can always send you a prospectus and we can have a conversation.